In this lesson, we'll be creating a reusable navbar component. Why? Because navbars are everywhere on the site. In the example I'm building, there are 7 navbars total. And just like we learned in Website Development 1, I'll drop in a navigation structure here with an unordered list, some list items, and anchors with some text. And this is the basic structure we'll use for every navigation. To turn this into a component, we're going to create a nav block and then identify each element of that block, such as the list, the item, and the link. Now we can select each block and element with great specificity from our CSS. The other thing you need to do, and this is highly situational, so you might want to think about this now and add it in a second, but give the nav tag a second class as well. So using just nav allows us to refer to any navigation element, but by giving each nav a specific name, in addition, we can target that specific nav and customize its properties, like to make it smaller or larger or align it differently. So the only change I'm going to make from the last resource so far is I'm just going to substitute these lists of these navigation components for the text I currently have in each section. So where it says main navigation, I'm going to put in like a mock main navigation structure in there for right now. And you'll see the page get all weird. And this is good because we want to approach this following the cascade from top down structure, big to small, outer to in. First, if you're following along with my system here and you're using debugging, I did add 2 new debugging sections for navigation. So I'm directly targeting the nav class and the nav items to make them have a thick orange border with a light orange background, while the nav items have a white background and a thinner dash border. As with any new component, let's consider the very first step of styling. That's the browser's default styling. Based on what's happening on my page, I am not in love with the browser's default styling. So in order to change it, we have some choices. In this component, I'm using a nav element, an unordered list, a list item, and an anchor tag. So after browser defaults are base styles. The only one I have defined at the moment is for the lists. Because of the reset, I did take away margin and padding for everything and then had to add it back so that bullet list looked normal otherwise. So the question is first, do we want to style anything here? And to answer this question, you have to consider, will the change we're going to make at this level be the change we want? For instance, in my navigation items, I really don't want the bullet to be there, and I don't want there to be any padding. So in this case, I might remove all the padding from the OL to UL, but that would be incorrect because that affects every single list on my website, and sometimes I do want a list. So changing something at this level may not be appropriate unless you're absolutely sure it's going to affect every list on your website the way you want it to. In this example, the way lists are used to display information versus the way I use them from navigation is completely different. I'm going to bypass any changes to my base styles at this point. Then you might be thinking, what's next? Well, layout is next. While navbars are an important part of the structure of your website, unlike the header and the footer, they are reusable. And that's a key distinction. Since they're reusable, we're going to put them into the component section instead, and we're going to use that nav class that we put into every navigation element. Now that we have only the nav items selected, and not every nav, UL, LI, and anchor on the site, we can then globally remove the list bullets, take away the margin and padding, and as well as adjust the anchors, remove the links, and inherit the color as well. And we'll also turn them into a block. That way they'll expand to 100% of their space. And because of this, we can add a little bit of padding on if you want. Just remember, we're applying these to every navigation item, whether it's in the footer, the header, or on the page somewhere. So be sure you want this to happen for every single one. To have a little bit more visual control over the navigation components, let's turn each one into a flex box. To help out, I added some comments in here for each block and element for the nav component. In order to know which elements to put properties on, it's nice to be able to use the BEM naming conventions, but we do have to know what HTML element is being used. That way we know what properties we can set and what the defaults are for that element. For instance, if I want all the nav items to be the flex items of the flex box, that tells me I need to apply the flex display to the nav list or the unordered list. And when I do this, you can see that all the navigation components become flexbox and their elements are now lined up in a row. While we want this behavior in the header, I'm not sure I want this in the footer. And rather than being columns in the footer, and we have a few ways to do that. We can come down here and we can say site footer. That's the section that those are in. And then we can say I would like all nav lists inside of the site footer to have a flex direction of column. Now consider this, we just created a very specific CSS. By that I mean we have two classes we're referring to. We're referring to one class that has to be found inside of the other. So now we have a dependency here. So when you start doing this, it's perfectly fine to do this. Just be sure your foundation's solid, and if you make any changes later on, you're going to have to remember to come back and adjust this relationship too. In this instance, we're grabbing all of the nav lists inside the entire site footer. If I go back to my index page, one thing I did do is I gave each nav element the same class. So site-footer __ nav. You can see that each one has this class. So to be more specific than just site footer, which is up here, this would grab every list inside of the footer. So what if I wanted a list over in the email sign up area? That means that my CSS would affect that list as well. If I don't want the CSS to cover that wider range, I can make it even more specific by first grabbing this class and then grabbing inside of it, grabbing the nav list from inside of that. So if I copy this class right here, the one that every footer nav has, go back to my CSS and replace site footer with this, you can see the same thing happens. Nothing changed when I hit save, but what we're doing now is we're creating a much more specific selector. This is going to help avoid conflicts later on. And if your CSS is starting to get confusing, this is a great time to throw in a little comment there and write down what you just did and kind of why. That way you can remember it next time you see it. The next step involves fine-tuning these sections. Each nav should be a part of a greater section, like a grid or a flexbox that we worked on with the header or the footer. As a result of that, we're going to switch mindsets one more time and start thinking about our areas in relationship to what structure is behind them. That way, if we need to align something in the center, or align something vertically, or create margin around an object, we know how to do that whether we're in a grid item or a flexbox item, because some of those properties are slightly different. For instance, I'm going to adjust my secondary navigation up on the top left of the header there. I really want to be sure that that section lines up to the left at all times, but doesn't bump up against the edge of the screen, so I want to give it a little bit of margin in there as well. So how do I go about doing that? Since this is part of a grid structure, I know I can find that because I gave it a grid area name. And sure enough, I have a section here called site-header __ nav-secondary. That represents the navigation element in HTML. Since this element is part of a grid, I know I can justify it by saying justify self. Since we are inside of the element, we're going to justify ourselves to the start to make sure we line up to the left. And then we'll add a margin to the left of, in this case I'm going to grab a variable, and we'll try spacing small. Okay, that just gives it a nice breath of fresh air on the left there. Let's check out social media. Let's justify self. I want that to align to the right. So we say end in this case. And then we're going to add a margin to the right. The same thing. Okay, we can copy this. And I'm going to paste the whole thing in the user navigation as well to create the same effect. And then for the primary navigation, I'm going to justify self to the center. Now the primary navigation and the user navigation in this case are aligned to the top because the logo is too big and is stretching the space. So what I'm going to do in the nav primary, I'm also going to say align self as center, and I'm going to look for the user, say align self center as well. If I want to customize anything about these particular sections, I could go in and say, for instance, nav secondary. I could say font size. We'll go to get a variable here. I think I have one called font small. So we'll make that font a little bit smaller. And I'll do the same thing for the social media links and also the user links. So that way the main navigation is the largest. One more thing I want to fix is the space around the padding around the main navigation could be a little bit more. So I'm going to find nav primary, and how do we grab just the navigation in that section, right? So I'm going to grab this section, and then I'm going to refer to the nav link within that section, and I'm going to say padding equals var spacing small and var spacing medium. We're going to put two variables in there. The first one refers to the top and bottom padding, and the second one refers to the left and right padding. And I think that feels a little bit better in terms of spacing for that menu. All during this process, I'll be going back to my original HTML file and removing the class debug to see how it looks. Another thing I've been doing is bringing up my example website side by side to compare. And as you'll see, we're not quite there yet. Wow, is it a lot closer. And it's really solid right now. My layout might be simple at this point, but it is professionally set up. And if you continue to attend to it with this level of care, patience, and organization throughout the semester, you won't end up being completely stuck in a few weeks. As CSS conflicts and new pages start causing conflicts with other pages, or becomes fragile, like if you change something, something else changes in a very unexpected way. At this point, I'm going to stop. I think you've seen enough to play with. Please continue going and see how accurate you can get the header and footer for your sites before we move on next week and start adding content to our sites.